Okay, good morning. I'm Rob Myers, and I am with Agile for All. I'm one of the coaches and trainers at Agile for All, and we're going to do a little Ask Me Anything today. I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it with a couple of questions that came through Twitter primarily, and we'll just jump right into that, and then we'll see where we go from there. So the very first question that I encountered when we were talking about doing this was how as an engineering team, as a software development team, do we actually do the building of user stories, especially thinly sliced user stories? So as you know, with Agile teams, what we're hoping to do is to build just a very thin slice of software all the way through the architecture with releasable quality. So it's really working software, but it touches on all the layers that it needs to touch on, but it's very thin. It doesn't do a whole lot. We're not going to release the software with just that story, but the story is demonstrable and has releasable quality. And one of the problems that we run into with Scrum teams is that over time, as they're building these things, they run into a problem. And the problem is that software doesn't really get sliced that way. Okay, it doesn't, let me see if I can wave my hands correctly here. It doesn't really get built like one slice and then another slice next to it and then another slice next to it, right? What actually happens is that you build out one slice and it touches all the parts of the architecture just barely. And then when you build the next story, you're actually touching the software that you built last time, right? So every time, and it tends to be the case that the things that get the most churn are the deepest in the architecture. Things like the data structures, right? Those are the things that change most frequently. So the question becomes, well, how do we do that without breaking everything? And very quickly, teams run into this problem, and it's something that software developers feel very viscerally, but the rest of the team may not necessarily understand it. So that's one of the reasons why we have agile engineering practices like test-driven development and behavior-driven development. What we want to do in those cases when we start a new thinly sliced story is to express the behaviors, the new behaviors that we want to create in our software using some kind of testing framework, using Cucumber or using the unit testing framework, and to express those behaviors and then build those behaviors, express a few more behaviors, build a few more behaviors. Now, that's going to help in the short term, but what it really does is it protects the investment in the behaviors in the long term. Okay? So the stories and features that we've built in previous releases and previous sprints are all protected by these tests. So we can go in and make any change that we need to as long as we run the tests, and that will express all of the other behaviors and protects all of the other behaviors so that we can move forward with confidence. Now, if you're in the situation that most Scrum teams are in, you've been working without tests, you haven't adopted a test-driven development or a behavior-driven development practice, what you need to do then is look at doing characterization testing, which is essentially doing the same thing. It's, okay, I've got this piece of code that I'm about to change. It doesn't have tests. That really scares me, right? And maybe scared isn't quite the right word, but there is a certain level of fear because, you know, I talk to teams all the time and they'll talk about, you know, changes in theory, but they won't actually go and make the change. And the reason why is because they're afraid of breaking something very critical. And you can imagine if you break something at a very low level, you've broken everything, right? So you're going to cover that area of behavior with a characterization test. You can either use Cucumber or you can use your unit testing framework, the same kind of thing. So you're building a patch into your safety net of tests, essentially. This is it's a challenging approach, but it's a very rewarding approach. One of the things I found very early on is that it really helps shape the design of your code and make it more changeable. So a good design is a changeable design, and this just adds to that. It allows the design to change as needed. And so what we would do is we'd effectively only look as far as the sprint plan, right? You can only look at the stories that you have in the sprint plan, and only design for those stories that you have in the sprint plan, no further, because you don't know what's coming next, right? Your product owner could change their minds, change the backlog, and then you have to adapt to that. And you actually want to be able to adapt to that. That's where the interesting things really start to happen, is when your product owner wakes up one morning and says, oh, if only we had this one little tiny change. And if you can, if you throw up your hands and go, well, sorry, right, then your product owner is not happy. But if you can say, hey, we can do that for you, we can do that in one sprint, that's an amazing feeling. And it's very powerful, and it's happened on every single one of the software development teams that I used these techniques on. Every single one of them. About 6 or 8 different teams. Maybe once every 6 months, we'd run into this story, and it would just overwhelm us. It would be like, wow, we hadn't ever thought of that. And we developed it and delivered it in less than a sprint. So pretty amazing stuff. So, these are very powerful techniques. The second question that I had, and I'll go ahead and cover that, is how do we encourage a team that's skeptical or just, sort of has inertia around building things a certain way? We have maybe cowboy programmers who are used to being the heroes. How do we establish the technical practices on a team that's reluctant to try them? And especially this particular question came from somebody who said, I'm not the lead developer, I'm not the manager, how am I supposed to influence my team? And I'll tell you, the good news in that case really is that you're in the same boat as the technical lead, the Scrum Master, the project manager, whomever, because you really can't make people do things. You're not going to be able to go, well, we're just going to do test-driven development because I said so. Nobody's really able to do that. Now, they could say that, and the team might pretend or sort of think that they're trying to do this, but they're not really going to do it for the right reasons, and it's not going to give you the right results. What we need to do is we need to find the intrinsic motivators of the team. We need to find out what's causing the team pain. Are they having a lot of defects? Do they have a lot of really severe defects? Do they spend evenings and weekends working on defects? Do they spend a lot of their time in the debugger? I have to tell you, from the very start, from 1998 forward, when I was working on teams that were doing test-driven development, there was one time in 2002 where we counted the number of times that we used the debugger. The entire team used the debugger twice in 1 year. Basically on average, once every 6 months. And I remember this clearly because I remember the first time I had to fire up the debugger, I couldn't remember how to use it. It had been so long since I'd used it. Like, well, how do I even use this thing? So we had to go and look at the documentation for a debugger. Wouldn't that be nice if you could spend less of your time in a debugger? So look for those opportunities on your team. Hopefully you're doing retrospectives. Bring it up at every retrospective. Gosh, we've got this problem with defects, or we spend an awful lot of time in the debugger. Is there something we could do about this? See where the pain points are, and then maybe make a suggestion. The nice thing about Scrum, the nice thing about a very short sprint, for example, a 1 week or a 2 week sprint, is that you can do an experiment and do it for a sprint or a month, and just check back at the next retrospective and go, well, how's it going? So it's freeing the notion that you can just do something as though you're supposed to, right? We're going to do TDD like we mean it, right? Let's do pair programming like we mean it. And then at the end of the sprint, we check back and go, well, how's that going? Is it something we want to continue? Is it something we want to modify? Okay, so that's one of the places on a Scrum team that you can sort of intrude into the Scrum team an idea. Why don't we do this TDD practice, or why don't we do this other practice? So it's not that. Well, let me put it this way. It's going to take a while, right? But what you're doing effectively is you're showing the team that it has pain. And it's pain that they don't really need to be doing. You're going to get a lot of, well, that's just the way things are. And I can tell you, you can send them to me. I'll let them know that's not the way it is. That hasn't been the way it is for me since 1998. I've got a team that's still operating since 2002 out in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They've been working on this software for that long. They make changes every 2 weeks. And the last time that a software developer had to work an evening or a weekend was in 2004. Okay, so that's 14 years without a major show-stopping defect. 14 years. And by the way, this is a life-critical application, not just a mission-critical application. This is one of those applications where if you get something wrong, somebody might die. So it's very important to them to be doing the testing, and yet at the same time, they make changes days before they go live. Okay, so all of these things are possible. If these techniques don't work for you, if you're just getting frustrated, the alternative, and I'll say this from the standpoint of maybe within a large organization, maybe you can find another team to work with. Okay, that's the that's the nuclear option. Is one of the, and that's actually I have to admit that's the approach that I took. After 1998, I was so enamored by using test-driven development and those sorts of practices. The quality of the code that I was building was so much greater than anything I'd ever encountered before. So I chose after that point to only work with teams that were doing these practices, and that was it. It was just, it was kind of self-selective. There were times where, I was eating ramen, but it's been definitely worth it. So, to talk a little bit about one of the things that's coming up for me is that, like I said, I've been at this since 1998, and as from a software developer standpoint, I mean, people always talk about software design, and a lot of people that maybe aren't technically oriented don't really understand why we're doing software design. What is software design? Is it something that we have to do up front? And one of the things that people often wonder is, well, are we spending an awful lot of time doing refactoring? Is refactoring a valuable thing to be doing? And refactoring is, on an Agile team, the design phase, if you will. It's not really a phase. You don't do it, at a particular time. You do it all the time. You're constantly refactoring. Test-driven development includes refactoring. And in fact, refactoring is that powerhouse. It's that engine that allows the team to change the code so that these new stories that are coming in can get completed in a timely manner and actually provide you with a lot of business value. So refactoring is kind of the core there. And don't be afraid to try things with your software. Well, maybe this is is this a strategy pattern or is this something else? Let's try these two things. Let's try it two different ways. Which one feels better? Which one looks better? And the reason why I bring that up is because one of the things I found really early on is that our domain model isn't always what we think it is. Oftentimes we start out trying to model reality. And in 1998, even, one of the very first time I ever tried this, we were modeling storage area network software. And we were writing storage area network software, and storage area networks were a new and crazy thing. And they're probably kind of often, it's a little bit like an early cloud, I guess, although they didn't really operate, they just had data. And I suppose they were kind of a failure. And in fact, in this case, the software was a success, but the hardware was a failure. So decide whether that's a failure or not. But okay, going back to the story. We first started out, we weren't doing test-driven development. We weren't doing extreme programming practices, anything like that yet. We modeled tape drives and disk drives and that sort of thing. And we tried to get them to operate, and we were trying to figure it all out. And we were struggling. And then our Agile coach at the time, a gentleman named Fred George, shows up. He's like, well, that's because those aren't your business objects. Those aren't your models. And I don't know what they are, but that's not them. So we followed his approach and built the software, test-driven. And we actually had one-day sprints. We would do a little bit of planning in the morning, a little bit of a review in the evening, and a little retrospective in the evening, right before the end of the day. And that was pretty much our whole sprint, was one-day sprints. I don't think we knew any better at that time, so we tried it. And it really was successful. And the objects in our model were things like needs and wants. We actually had an abstract class called need and an abstract class called want. And that was actually what people what the software needed to be, because the policy-based storage area network software was essentially, I need this, I need triple redundancy with this data. This data is very important to me. I also need to be able to access it within, a few milliseconds, or I don't need to have it within a few milliseconds. I need the storage to live for, 1,000 years. So write it out onto tape. Hopefully tape lasts 1,000 years. I don't know. Does anybody even use tape anymore? But that's the sort of model that came about from this. And it was really not thought out or planned up front at all. We didn't think about these objects. We didn't draw UML. We just did test-driven development, and we, listened for the code smells and refactored them away. So, changes with teams you worked with. I'm not sure what that means. Do we have a changes with the teams you worked with? Looking at the next question. Good time for a sip of coffee. Okay, so yeah. Well, I do often get this question about, well, do we need coaching or do we need training? And of course, it's kind of unfair for me to answer this way, but it's also the truth. You need both. I've found that initially, you could probably get there with coaching alone. We did. I mean, in 1998, we had a coach. And we just jumped right in and worked on our stuff, and he made a lot of adjustments at that point. But the other thing that I've found is that oftentimes, if we're going to try some new practice, if we're going to learn how to do test-driven development and do it well, or behavior-driven development and do it well, we need the opportunity to step back and sort of give ourselves a little mini vacation away from our own backlog and our own, we've got this code base that we're afraid to change. Well, let's not work on that then. Let's step aside and actually practice the new practice and get, they like to say, on the same page, right? I guess that works. You're all learning the same terminology, you're all learning the same techniques, and you're communicating with each other which ones are working, and you're actually teaching each other. And so courses are very, very handy to have to sort of create that time box. Okay. Can you give an example of how you refactored away? Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to remember when I said that. If I said refactor away the code smells, probably something like that, or just yeah, that was probably it. So here's one of my best stories. It's also one of my oldest. So in 2001, I was working with Jim Shore, and if you don't know him, he's a great guy. He wrote a book it's called The Art of Agile Development, and it's really good, but it's also really big. So I think a lot of people are a little put off by the size of the thing, but it isn't the kind of thing that you need to read cover to cover. Anyway. So he and I are working together in 2001, and of course, working together, that was where he got all his great ideas for his book, of course. And we had a situation where we were building web applications. We had a web application suite that was, one of the things that it did was it was like an early Survey Monkey. Survey Monkey, you create surveys. So you create questions and you create multiple choice answers or whatever you want to do. That sort of thing. And we had always been assuming that we were going to be able to get away with Latin American internationalization. In other words, we figured we could handle North America, French, right, English, and Spanish, and that was it. And those, incidentally, all fit into the same ASCII, based character sets, right? So Latin American character set. So we were building along for about a year or so, and this was actually before I got started on this project. They were already working on this code, and then the the product owner basically came in one day and said, okay, team, I know that I said this would never happen, but here's what's happening. We're really popular in Japan, except that Japanese people do not want to write their surveys in English. And she said, could you re-internationalize the entire application suite to handle Unicode, UTF-8, the whole, or UTF-16, I don't remember exactly the details, but basically all the Unicode characters so that we could handle Japanese language and Chinese language. What they needed to be able to do is they needed to be able to type in their own character set in the browser, have it stored in the database in that character set, and return when it was going out to the people who were receiving the surveys in the right format. So it didn't, and what it would do at that time was you could actually enter it and it would come back out in boxes. It would be gobbledygook, right? So can you fix that? And of course, I was new on the team, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, that's a major architectural change. I had just been working with other teams that, internationalization was something they had to bake in from the very beginning. And usually they just, the whole company just collapsed under the weight and they went out of business. That's also called the .com, by the way, or .bomb is the other name for it. So here we are, and I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? And Jim Short, he says, well, let's take a look at the code, and they actually spend about 10 minutes looking at the code as a team, and he says, we think we can get that done in a single sprint in about 3 days. And I was really surprised. I thought, wow, what does he know that I didn't quite see there? And it turns out that because they had been refactoring and shaping the code for today's needs at all times, that the area of the code where input and output were going through was in one, or two classes. And so whatever the changes were, and we literally had no idea what changes to make, whatever the changes were needed to happen in those two places. So, and that was not a planned thing. That was not a design thing. It would just happen by refactoring away the code smells, by refactoring away the duplication. And it just came to the point where every single thing that the user typed in went through one series of code, and every single thing that was transmitted from the database went out through a single set of code. And it did take us 3 days. We spent 2.5 days researching it. It wasn't widely available. There were a lot of sites that didn't do this. Microsoft's site couldn't do it. Lots of sites couldn't do it. The only site that could actually do it was Babelfish or Alta Vista at the time. The effectively the same thing as Google Translate is now. So we knew it was possible. We didn't know how to do it in Java. We figured out how to do it in Java. It was effectively 4 lines of code, I think, maybe more like 10 lines of code. So think about that, 10 lines of code in 3 days. That's, that's pretty much successful, right? That's productivity, 10 lines of code in 3 days. So we did do it in 10 lines of code, and unless you count the amount of test code, I think we had about 50 unit tests around that code. It was bulletproof, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, a lot of it was copy paste and change it to a different character set, but there weren't a whole lot of behavioral changes. Hold on just a second. I am just going to. There we go. Okay, just a little adjustment on there. Okay. Let's see. So, did I finish that story? Oh, well, if you think about it, one of the things that I like to point out is that the Japanese and Chinese market are very large markets. And so can you imagine a user story that would open up a market that large in your backlog, showing up in your backlog, and you have to decide, okay, can we do this, or do we say, no, I'm sorry, but that would take 6 months? If we had said, sorry, that would take 6 months, she would have never scheduled it in, right? So major architectural changes. And okay, so the interesting thing is we looked back and we said, Well, that was because of the refactoring, which was because we had such a thorough set of very fast unit tests. I mean, we had thousands of unit tests that ran within about 10 or 15 minutes. So within 10 or 15 minutes, we were, everything was just awesome, right? We would know that whether we had broken anything or not. And that it's an amazing thing. And when I got finished with that particular story, I remember thinking, well, that'll never happen in my career ever again. That was just a one-off amazing case where, something radical came along and we were able to implement it in just a few days because we had been doing such diligent refactoring. And lo and behold, I would say that once about every 6 months for the next 4 years, on average, one of those stories would show up where we would be just like, wow, where did this come from? And, who asked for this? And, oh, that's neat. And then, of course, in 2002, I remember we had one of those on the Otis 2 project, the one that's still running that I talked about earlier. And I got to be the one who, sort of received it and looked at the team, and the team was like, "Oh my gosh, this is a major architectural change." And then I'm like, "Yeah, 3 days. We'll have it done for you in 3 days." And then we had it done in 3 days. So at that point, I would say I started to realize that this wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a one-off thing. What you're doing is you're conditioning your code so that it is able to receive radical changes. It's able to receive innovative user stories, whereas it wasn't, or it wouldn't have been otherwise. So when you're sitting there writing unit test after unit test after unit test, eventually that's going to feel like the right way to do things. But if it doesn't feel that way yet, just think about, maybe someday I'll be able to introduce a new user story. All right, so I would like to just really quick mention that I have a certified Scrum developer course, which could also be known as extreme programming immersion. Effectively, it's almost the same thing. It's a course that deals with all of the technical practices that we've been discussing today, as well as a few others. And it's very immersive. We like to throw you into it in the deep end, but I'm there to keep you from drowning. And it's a lot of fun for me, and as well as the people who show up. I promise. We're going to be working on a science fiction game is what we work on. I know that that has absolutely nothing to do with what you do on the day-to-day basis, and that's kind of the idea. And that's coming up. I'm looking at the... yeah, here it is. March 14th through 16th. Okay, so March 14th through 16th, certified Scrum developer in Denver, Colorado. And hope to see you there. That's all for me. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. I'm looking for the end broadcast button. There it is. All right. Thanks very much for tuning in. Bye-bye.